Hi, I'm Christopher Warnock of Renaissance Astrology. Today I'm going to talk about talisman elections in general, and I'm also going to talk about the difference between creation and consecration elections for talismans. So I think that really the key point I want to make is that I'm not insisting that there's only one approach, which of course, would be my approach that's correct, um, and everybody else is wrong. And this seems to be the predominant way that people come across this. There seems to be a tremendous amount of fear, and I think partly it's because it's easy to tear other people down, but also I think people are really frightened to death that they might be making a mistake, they might be breaking the rules, and that really is a problem. What I would say about this is that there are many possible approaches, okay? And I just do not buy for a second that if you make some minor mistake or even a major mistake, that there's going to be some horrific, horrible consequences, or even that it's, necessarily not going to work. There's lots of different ways of going about this. And I think that we really need to turn the temperature down as far as concern and fear about what you're doing. But like I said, do it your way, find the way that resonates for you, and then respect the fact that other people are doing it their way and having a preference for doing that. So one of the things that always needs to be emphasized with elections is that no election is perfect. Okay, if you want to take it and tear it apart, it would be impossible for anybody. I was sort of bad around the idea of having the Warnock challenge, and that anyone could submit, an election to me, and then I could, 100% of the time I could find something wrong with it, 100% of the time. So it's a bit like someone said to me, select, a date for me for in the next half an hour of the people that walk down the street. And so you pick the best one. They said, oh, I don't like this or that about them. I mean, you're always dealing with this limited set of factors you can work with, okay? And then the other thing is that in an election, as opposed to a natal chart, you're not looking at the whole chart. So if someone comes in from a modern natal perspective and then tries to look at a medieval Renaissance election, they're first of all, they're using different techniques, they're looking at different things, and then they're also looking at the entire chart. And they're also doing this kind of like the typical random factor thing that's modern, is that there's not set factors, it just sort of stuff pops out at them. So if you're going to look at a chart for an election, and you're going to choose it, what you're going to have to always recognize is that you're maximizing the positives and minimizing the negatives, but there's only so much of that you can do. And it's really an art to say, okay, this is good enough for, given the circumstances. I mean, if you're too, if you look at the Picatrix, for example, you've got a whole bunch of different books that were put together, not meant to be used simultaneously. And there's, 50 or 100 rules. It would be impossible to find any election that would fit every single rule in Picatrix. And then when you add in all our other medieval Renaissance sources, it's, absolutely totally impossible. I mean, classic one is if you look, for example, Ramsey, Astrology Restored. He gives under marriage elections. He just summarizes all the sources, you know, and it's impossible to follow all those, and clearly they don't. And they'll come back and say, Picatrix sometimes will say, well, if you can't follow that, then do these things. So there's a recognition right there that it's impossible to follow all the factors. And so their tendency was just to list off every single source that they have ever come across to what the factors are, and then really not, give a way of reconciling those sources. I mean, an interesting example is if you've ever looked at John Dee's election for the coronation of Queen Elizabeth, it's not a very good election. It really isn't. It's at noon. I think they had to have it at noon. And, I think that Virgo's in it or something because, the Virgin Queen and everything. But otherwise, really not a very good election. And another example, this is Gadbury's Astrologicum Nauticum, which is about ships, but gives one of the very few examples we have of giving a technique and then laying out the chart. So he gives a chart that's based on the birth of the ship, very interesting, a horary about the ship, and then just trying to get a good election. And what's interesting about the natal-based and the horary-based ones is that they are not good elections. I mean, if you look at the electional chart, again, they're not very good. So it's interesting to see the gap between the 500 rules and then the actual elections that come up. And so in reality, you're only really going to be able to elect maybe 3, 4, 5 things if you want to be able to make it in the next year or so. Okay? But nevertheless, with a talisman, you can come up with a very strong set of factors and avoid a lot of the negative stuff. But the reality is that here's what people are doing. If they're actually looking at specific factors, what they have to do is to pick certain factors that they're going to pay attention to and that we're going to have in the chart, and then the other factors we're just not going to pay attention to. And so you can either do that consciously, which is what I try to do, or you can do it unconsciously. Okay? And you can pretend that you're following all 50 rules, but you're only actually following a discrete set of them. And a way that people can do this is, for example, you're doing an election, let's say it's a marriage election, and this is the ruler of the first and the ruler of the seventh represent the spouses. Ruler of the first is in detriment, the ruler of the seventh is in fall. They're applying to an opposition. Oh, but the moon is Kazemi. Oh, there you go. That's a Hail Mary. It's a save. That's a way of doing that. Yes, I follow the rules, but no, I've got a save that wipes all the rules out. That's not following the rules. And so, when people come and they criticize other people's stuff, all they're doing is saying, my way is the only way, my way is the only correct way, everybody else is wrong, and then they're ignoring the fact that someone could turn around and do the same thing to them. And what I used to do, years ago on my discussion group, is that I would not allow people to criticize other people's elections except by offering another election themselves. And invariably, the election that people offered when they didn't like the election that was posted was worse. Okay, they could not come up with a better election themselves. So, it's a good example of criticizing people for stuff that they're not able to fulfill themselves. So, like I said, the reality of elections is you essentially, it's an art of, as I said, minimizing the negative, maximizing the positive, and then reaching a balance that's practical. Now, if you go too far, and you only have a few factors, then it's not a very powerful election. So you really need to have a balance between trying to require way too many factors so it's impossible to actually make it, or having so few factors that it's way too weak. And so that's what I try to do. And what I do is, for example, with Picatrix, I think of it in a sort of modular way. So what I'll do is each section, each chapter will lay out a discrete number of conditions, both positive and negative, that you need to have awareness of. And I'll basically sort of focus on that. So my guide for planetary talismans is Picatrix Book 2, Chapter 10. And the factors that are laid out there, more or less, if you look at the elections, the essence of them is that the planet be well dignified in essential dignity, so typically exalted or dignified by sign, but you can also get it from multiple lesser dignities. And then the planet be rising or culminating, because those are the most powerful placements in accidental dignity, and then it'd be the planetary hour of the planet. And then finally, it not be afflicted in a major way. Now, again, how you determine if something afflicted or not is going to depend on the astrologer. For me, it tends to be being combust, being retrograde, or making an applying opposition or square, or a conjunction to an afflicted planet. Those also. But again, getting into the weeds about that and arguing about it doesn't make a whole lot of sense, because it devolves into preference, okay? And anyone that's claiming that, oh no, this is objective scientific reality, and I made a talisman, and then, like I said, my head exploded because I had this particular factor, it's just being ridiculous, okay? It's way too subjective, it's way too anecdotal, and again, the causality is not clear. So, again, with that in mind, in terms of the elections, and just recognizing that there's only a limited amount of factors and that none is perfect, let's just talk a little bit about the difference, at least in my approach, between a creation talisman and then a consecration talisman. So I'm coming from a devotional approach, and my view is that when you're working with the planets, what you're doing is you're at least the way I'm doing it is you're forming a relationship with them. That you're dealing with they're beings, they're people. They have an external reality. They're not something like chaos magic that you've created yourself, like a Mickey Mouse as God. They actually, if you didn't exist, then there would still be an archangel of Jupiter. They do have an internal existence. I mean, the planets are inside of us as well. But they have an external reality. They're not created by ourselves. And so what we're doing in a devotional practice is we're trying to develop our relationship to the spirits, the angels of the planets and fixed stars or whatever else you're working with. And that's where the magic is. It's not the typical way of thinking of a talisman is it's a dead object that you sort of charge with some kind of energy, impersonal energy. It radiates energy out and you got to recharge it. And this is what the whole process of what we're doing here. When you're electing and you're consecrating, it's all a charging process of this, like I said, dead thing. And the magic's in the talisman. From the devotional perspective, the talisman is a way of interacting with the angels, with the spirits of that planet or fixed star, mansion of the moon, or whatever celestial thing you're working with. And so when we create the talisman, what we're doing is and again, the talisman is what I would call a high intensity interaction because you have a very powerful, you're going to get the maximizing the strength of that particular planet or fixed star or whatever at the moment of the creation. So you're making it a time that's very, very positive, very, very strong for that particular planet or whatever celestial factor you're dealing with. Now, what that means is, again, we're using that Picatrix formula with the planet in this sign or exaltation, a strong and essential dignity, rising or culminating, planetary hour, and then unafflicted, is that you may not be able to make those talismans very often. I mean, Saturn, he goes through the entire zodiac in 29 years. You'll have, long stretches like when Saturn's in Cancer and Leo, you can't make Saturn talismans at all. And so you basically, if you wanted to do a Saturn talisman or have a high intensity interaction with Saturn, you'd be out of luck. I mean, it's typical. Saturn also goes retrograde a lot. And Picatrix even says that he's worse. It's bad for him to be retrograde. It's even worse for him to be retrograde and dignified. So, which is interesting. So Saturn is, not in a good state to be making talismans very, very often at all. And so for that high intensity, powerful interaction with Saturn, you can't do it very often. So when we make a talisman, what we do is we wait for a point, a high intensity point, a point that has all these, maximizes these factors, minimizes the negatives, and then we create the talisman. And that talisman in a devotional approach then is a way, it's almost like having the cell phone number of the spirit. You could also conceptualize as the spirit has ensouled the talisman, and you're interacting then with the talisman as a way to basically interact with the spirit. So those, like I said, I categorize that as a high intensity, multi-factor, very intense thing. Now, the reality of it in terms of the creation of the talisman, if you're going to want to have a high intensity interaction, it can't happen very often. I mean, this is just the bottom line with it. Now, a consecration talisman, when we make our talismans, we always consecrate them when they're made. It calls the spirit into it, enables that connection to the talisman to be a connector to the spirit. And really, without consecration, you're losing a lot of the power of the talisman. Now, in the medieval Renaissance, they had this natural magic view, and someone like Albertus Magnus, talks about you can make a talisman for getting rid of scorpions, and you put a scorpion image on it, and you make it with Scorpio rising, and then you afflict the ascendant, and you don't do any kind of invocation or consecration. You're not calling any spirits, because they were really freaked out about the idea that you might be dealing with evil spirits, and that would be a bad thing. So the view was that it sort of automatically worked. It was natural magic. That dovetails very nicely with a modern view that there's nothing except matter and energy, and so there's some kind of energetic, it's the material of the object or whatever, and there are no spirits. I mean, you don't invoke spirits because they just simply don't exist, so it doesn't make any sense at all, and it's got to be some kind of energy because what else is there? It's nothing but matter and energy. So we're doing this astrology and magic that has to do with spirits and spiritual stuff, but we don't even think there's anything except matter and energy. Very illogical. But nevertheless, so those kind of fit together. Again, there are some modern talisman makers that it looks to me like that's what they're doing, is that they're only assembling it at that time and they're not doing any invocation. They're like, well, you can do it yourself. I think that, again, it's not wrong. In the approach that I follow, it's not quite as powerful. So it's just one of those sort of trade-offs that you've got. So the thing that comes up, though, is that once you've got the talisman made, then for me, the view of the subsequent consecrations, it's the personal consecrations, which we really recommend to provide instructions for them with any Renaissance Astrology talisman, is to basically introduce yourself to the spirit of the talisman, to the archangel or angel or intelligence or whatever, however you want to conceptualize it, the angel, And then when you do the subsequent consecrations of it, you're keeping that, it's like a friendship. You're interacting with them in a positive way. You're building up that bond. You're causing the effects to come to you, and by being in the presence of and in contact with a spirit or angel of that planet, or again, fixed star, whatever you're dealing with. Now, the thing about consecrations is that I typically approach it as what I call a low intensity interaction. So rather than having multiple factors, it would be typically like maybe one factor or two factors. So for example, for planetary consecration, subsequent to the creation of talisman, I just use planetary hour. Okay? And that means if you wanted to do it every day, you could do it every day. And think about it. When I think about high versus low intensity, it reminds me of, like, let's say you had a friend and you only ever do anything with them, that's really intense. Like I said, you go on these weekend, adventure travel things. You go to Bali or something. You climb, K2. You're going to Paris and doing all this amazing stuff. But you only do that with them, say, once a year. And you have this incredible time with them. And then you have this other friend who you don't do anything particularly intense with them. You just go hang out with them. But you do that like a couple times a week, maybe almost every day sometimes. Who are you going to have the closest friendship with? Okay? I think often it's going to be the person that you saw the most. Even though it wasn't a very intense, like I said, high intensity encounter, the repetition brings a great amount of power to it. So basically what I would say about it is that, and so here's what people come to me. They'll get the talisman and they'll be like, oh, can I consecrate it with X, Y, and Z factors? And usually problematic stuff because, the planets are always retrograding and going combust and, all sorts of stuff going on with them. So people get worried about that and say, oh, is it okay? So what I say back to them is I say, look, my approach for the subsequent consecrations is just to do the planetary hours. So for planets, just a one factor thing. And you can do that, like I said, every day as often as you want. Do the consecrations whenever you feel like it on the appropriate planetary hour. Fixed stars, just with a fixed star rising or culminating. That allows you to do it constantly. Now, that really what it's closest to is my daily planetary practice. And I'll put a link in there to that daily planetary practice. That I do every single day. And I do an invocation of the planet that rules the day. And I don't even do planetary hour. I just basically do it. I have a set time in the evening that I do it, and I just do it every day. I've been doing that every day for 20 years, okay? And it doesn't matter what the current astrological state of the planet is, okay? I still do that. I interact with it. And it's sort of like a friend. It doesn't matter whether they're sick or upset or angry, or your mom or whatever. You call them up and you talk to them every single day, right? And again, you're friends with them. You have a close relationship with them. So the fact that they're kind of grumpy that or whatever, cranky that day, or not feeling that well, it doesn't really matter because that's just part of keeping that relationship strong. That's my approach. Okay. So, and I have, like I said, I haven't had a job in 30 years. I have a very middle class life. I am in good health. I'm up there 62 years old. So if there was some horrific, horrible consequences from doing a planetary invocation at the wrong time, then like I said, I should be dead. Okay, but I'm not. So that's what I would say about it is that when I make a talisman, yes, I am much more concerned about it because we're essentially freezing the moment of it. We want to have the maximum power that we can get. And I do have fairly strict standards that I'm going to follow for the creation of the talisman, again, because of high intensity encounter. And we're maximizing that power. But for the consecration stuff, the power is really from the repetitions, not from the astrological factor. We have an appropriate astrological factor, one or two probably. But the power is really coming from the fact that you're repeating it over and over and over again. And so that's my approach. Now, what I say to people is they say, well, what about, Mercury's retrograde? I said, look, you need to do what you feel comfortable with. Okay? And if you don't feel comfortable with Mercury retrograde, I totally understand that. It's not unreasonable. You should definitely go with that. That is your intuition. That's your preference. Go with that. Okay? And so this is the approach that I would really recommend for everybody. So insofar as I think that I'm right, what I'm saying is I think a lot of people nobody's 100% right, and people are more or less on or off. And the way to determine that is really personal and really preferential. So like I said, what I my message to the astrological community or esoteric community in general is this, is that recognize that a huge proportion of what we do is preference based, okay? And so if that's your preference, if that's your approach, it's nice to be able to show the logic of what you're doing. A lot of times people just do stuff emotionally. I can tell you why I do stuff and give you the logic and rationale behind it. And you can come back and say, you know what? I have a different logic or rationale, but it is not, doesn't make any sense whatsoever to come back and say that's wrong. You're not following the rules. There are not strict rules to this, okay? There's schools, they're like a language, like I said. And if you use the language completely improperly, it becomes incoherent. That's problematic. But ultimately, really what we're dealing with here is preference. And it would be hard, like I said, I find it strange for people that, I got the Baal rule. Didn't invent astrological magic, but the methodology basic framework that people are using is basically the one that I developed based on traditional sources. And so for people to say that Chris Warnock is doing it wrong makes no sense whatsoever. If you could say I do it differently, that's fine. And that's the approach that I have, okay? So again, what I would advocate here is just tolerance and a recognition of the fact that it's perfectly okay to have a preference and do it your way, but don't impose that on other people, okay? Have some respect for their approach and don't point the finger and don't be negative and don't be attacking other people just because they're not following your preference. It makes no more sense than saying everybody that likes chocolate ice cream is evil and is going to have their head explode and you have to eat vanilla ice cream. Doesn't make a lot of sense. So I hope that's helpful. And what I want to do also is dispel the fear that people have. Like I said, if you have a preference, if you're concerned about a particular factor, respect that, don't follow it. But I don't think you have to get that freaked out about it. Ultimately, I'll give you a good example. I had to have cataract surgery about 2 years ago. And when I was doing the surgery, they came in, they wanted to put me in a waiting room, before the surgery. And it was waiting room 13. And I'm like, I don't really like waiting room 13. They're like, okay. And they moved me over to waiting room 12. And this is to me an approach of how I think I approach it. Now, if they'd said to me, look, there's no other waiting rooms. This is all we've got. If you want to have the eye surgery today, you need to have room 13. I would have, okay, I'll do room 13. But since I had a preference there, I was feeling a little uncomfortable with it. Respect that preference if you can, but don't take it so seriously that you start, getting freaked out about it, or that you start, not having the cataract surgery or something important just because you can't get that. It's got room number 13, okay? And so I think, like I said, and again, if someone doesn't want to have number 13, I'm like, that's fine. I respect that preference, up to the point, unless they're saying like, it makes it impossible to do anything for them. At that point, it just becomes, it's sort of getting in your way. Don't let the fear overpower you. Really what this should be, and this is what I like the most about a devotional practice, is this is a very uplifting and a fear-removing practice. It's a very tranquil practice. It's really a way that you don't have to be afraid. You can be confident that the angels, you're not making a mistake. You're not going to have some, dealing with a demon that are going to attack you or something like that. Show respect, have confidence, be inspired, and it really is a calming and practice that I think is very advantageous. So again, I hope you find that interesting. And again, I hope you can, people will take away the idea of toleration and understanding the diversity of practice and the richness of the practice that we have.